Hi there, Scott here, founder and chief strategist at Emerging Impact. I've been solving complex multi-stakeholder problems for over 20 years now for business, society, and the earth. Everything from working with refugees in Iraq to protecting 250 million acres of forest in the southern US to pivoting a $30 billion, 66,000 person legacy tech company in the face of competition from Google and Amazon, with literally thousands of leaders and tens of thousands of actors in complex systems. And putting this together for you, I asked myself, what are the biggest mistakes I've seen change agents make? What are the ones they simply must avoid if they're to be successful? So I've summarized them here to help you leap ahead in your career as a change agent. So let's get started. So why this message? Why is this even necessary? Well, strategy and execution are fundamentally broken. I'm not going to read all of this detail here, but let's suffice it to say that there's around a 70% failure rate for most strategy and execution efforts, for most change efforts. And that's not just me talking. That's the Harvard Business Review, Forbes magazine, and others. So what's going on? Why such a high failure rate? There are 5 fatal mistakes. And they have to do with the meta context, the methodologies that were used, not conceiving of strategy as dynamic, rather as static, not designing a clear goal, and then not optimizing execution. Quite the opposite. Number 1, there are 3 dominant meta contexts essential to framing your mindset. This first one is this understanding that something is fundamentally broken. Now, I've shared this with every leader I've worked with for the last 7 years, and to a person, they've all at first been kind of startled and then seen it as just the truth. And it goes like this. Imagine a line moving up to the right at about a 45-degree angle. The specific slope isn't critical. Just know it's moving up to the right. And let's call that destruction, loss, demand, or need. And let's just say it's something like affordable housing. It could be poverty, it could be climate, it could be healthy food systems, but let's just call it affordable housing for sake of discussion. And imagine another line below that at say, 25 to 30 degrees slope. And let's call that regeneration, gain, supply, or fulfillment. Let's again just say affordable housing. Now there's only one thing that's so important about these 2 lines, and that is that they are not converging, and they never will. And that means that by definition, something is fundamentally broken in both what we're up to and how we're going about it. The second meta context has to do with the increasing complexity that we're encountering now. So imagine a vertical axis, and we're going to call that the number of issues or opportunities. Some call it the number of problems. The horizontal axis is time. Now, our typical ability to solve such problems might look something like this. Although many of my colleagues have said that line should be going down because the way we attempt to solve them now does more harm than good. And that refers us back to that 70% failure rate. Imagine now another line that is the rate of emergence of these complex multi-stakeholder problems. And that looks something like this. And it starts to go nonlinear when we move from beyond one problem, say economic, to the collision of the economy with COVID, with geopolitical conflict. That's when that really starts to take off. And we're seeing more and more of that today. So our greater problem is the gap between our typical ability to solve for these kinds of problems and their rate of emergence. So we simply have to solve for that. Here's a third meta context, and this comes from the work of Dave Snowden, with whom I trained for a while. And out of all of his work, this is what I appreciate the most. And I've adapted this to fit my audiences. So imagine on the right-hand side, this low change, high predictability world. And then on the left-hand side, this high change, low predictability world. I think we can all agree that we're moving rapidly from the one to the other. Dave calls out 4 kinds of systems: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. In a simple system, we first sense what's going on, then we categorize it, and then we respond. And there's typically just one best practice for that. The example I use from my youth is my 62 Chevy pickup that I used working on ranches and fishing boats in South Texas. It's either spark or it's fuel or it's air. It's one of those 3. And once you diagnose what it is, there's only one thing to do to fix it. Put gas in the tank, change the spark plugs, whatever that might be. Very simple. In a complicated system, you sense, then you have to analyze it because it's complicated, and then you respond. And in that case, there's a suite of good practices you can apply. There are several ways to approach solving that problem. And that's the way it is with automobiles today. My mechanic can't solve the problems in my car if he can't plug it into the computer. And once he does, he can either change the software, change the hardware, or add some sort of a chemical to the system that makes it better. In a complex system, though, and this is where I recognize Dave's genius before I ever trained with him. You probe. And the reason I recognize this is because I was a trauma psychotherapist for a number of years. And when you're working with someone who's psychotic or suffering from severe PTSD, you have no idea how the words that you use are going to impact that individual. And the last thing you can afford to do is to trigger their trauma all over again. So you probe, you use safe to fail probes, like was it hot or cold outside? Was it light or dark? Were you wearing a t-shirt or a sweater? You'll use things that are fairly innocent, and you're noticing whether or not their autonomic nervous system is being activated. Based on that, you then sense what's going on for them, and then you shape the next response. And in that sense, the solution to their issues are emergent. They arise from that individual themselves. And the same is true in any complex system. The solution must emerge from within the ecosystem in order to truly solve for their problem. In a chaotic system, like say Katrina, or the massive forest fires in California in 2017 and 19, and other kinds of chaotic situations, you have to first act. In the case of the fires in California, the first responders didn't even have time to pay attention to the fire. They just had to make people safe. Then you sense what you've got. Then you respond. And in those cases, the solutions are typically novel because it's chaos. It hasn't really happened before. There's not a plan for how to deal with it. Now, one of the most important things about this understanding is that simple and complicated systems can be managed with hierarchy. In a chaotic system, it's often autocracy or some sort of a group of individuals issuing orders because you don't have time for more information gathering and debate. You simply have to act. But in a complex system, a self-organizing network is the optimal management solution. If you don't know which of these systems you're in, you're likely to apply your favorite management technique, which in our culture tends to be hierarchy, and that will leave you in a state of disorder and confusion. One critical understanding here, if you take a complex adaptive system in the upper left-hand quadrant and you oversimplify it, that fold at the bottom indicates that you'll push it into chaos. So in the US, just think no new taxes and the current state of our infrastructure at a D plus or C minus, or 3 strikes you're out and the explosion of our prison populations, or just say no to drugs and the damage our drug wars has done both in the US and in other countries. So your fix here is your solution must be emergent. It must arise from within the ecosystem itself. And do know that whenever I've done that with my clients over the last 20 years, it's always exceeded the initial goal. I've had clients come to me and say, we know you're good at building movements or motivating a whole population of people in a certain direction. We'd like you to get them to do X. And I have to say to them, I'm so sorry, you don't understand how this works. They're going to determine what's needed in order to solve this complex problem. I can tell you that in every case so far, the solution has included and then transcended what the initial goal was. And given that it's emergent, know that you will be uncomfortable. This is a very different way of operating, much more real time, much more dynamic. Conventional methods. Well, we've already talked about the failure rate of those conventional methods, and here are a few reminders. And the conventional methods are the source of this fundamentally broken situation we find ourselves in. So your fix is to design for both ends of reality. What I typically find is that people are designing for one end or the other. So both ends of reality means, what does it mean to be fully human, acting in complex adaptive systems? And those two things are interdependent and they must be treated as such, a much more dynamic relationship. So you have to deliver the right initial conditions to enable those emergent solutions via a self-organizing network. Number 3, reconceptualizing strategy as dynamic versus static. This is the biggest mindset shift of all. As an example, here's a static view in the diabetes space. And by the way, I don't mean to be critical of this group. They're doing the very best they can based on what they know. But here's what they came up with. And again, I won't read these to you, but basically it's about building capacity, prevention, and dealing with environmental and socioeconomic risk factors. It's a list. And what it fails to convey here, though they may do it in some other fashion, is that each of these things is related to one another in a way that properly structured can create a flywheel. By offering it up as a 1, 2, 3 list, it doesn't recognize the dynamic nature of the problem. And this is recent. This was 2020. This was 44 experts from around the globe coming up with this strategy, this action plan. In 2019, however, I'd worked with a group of 65 scientists, researchers, academicians, physicians, journalists, big pharma, patients at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco to come up with a more dynamic strategy about how you approach diabetes and obesity. And here you'll see that reflected as an interrelated set of activities, of resources that must be coordinated as a dynamic whole if we're truly to affect the global diabetes and obesity epidemic. Key to that was establishing a measurable time-specific goal, identifying the critical drivers that determine our ability to achieve that goal, and then through an analysis, identifying the highest leverage opportunities to begin to affect that whole system. And what stunned us all was that the impact of stigma was the greatest obstacle to our ability to reverse the trend of what they call diabetes. It's hard to imagine how we would have uncovered the impact of stigma had we not done a rigorous, very thorough, systemic, and expert-based analysis of the ecosystem as a whole. And what do we mean by the impact of stigma? It's the largely unconscious bias that physicians in the room admit they have relative to obesity, that insurance companies have, that legislators have, those very policymakers that were talked about in that first example, that employers have, that even friends and family have, and worst of all, that those suffering from diabetes themselves have about themselves. And now that you're aware of what we mean by the impact of stigma, you can see how not dealing with that diminishes everything else that we might try to do in the system. Critical to their success was establishing a measurable time-specific goal for what they had to achieve by when in order for them to be successful, and then identifying the critical drivers for making that happen. From the social movement, because it wasn't going to happen top down, it had to happen from the bottom up, to how that social movement could help to transition the medical system from a disease-oriented system to a wellness-oriented system, and how those two things together could scale the movements in both of those domains to shift the way that we eat and exercise, and how that understanding to help design and structure the systems for optimal health. Now, this gets into what they talked about in the prior example about policymakers and legislators and things like that. And that allowed us to then diminish the impact of the systems that are designed for other than optimal health, like the snack food industries and things like that. So where did this insight come from? Came from a map like this, which I'm not going to take you into. But this is the dynamic view of the ecosystem as a whole, signed off on by those 65 experts from around the world, that we then rigorously analyzed to identify the handful of levers required to move that whole system. We then took that analysis and reconvened at IDEO's headquarters on the Embarcadero in San Francisco the next day to design specifically how we were going to execute on those leverage points. So your fix? Reimagine strategy as a real-time living entity, almost like it's a beast in its own competitive ecosystem. And to do that, pick your own performance metaphor that works. For me, I use the human body as a metaphor to think about it. This body can lie on the couch or it can compete internationally. It's the same system. It's simply a matter of how we load the resources in the system. Once you've got that system in mind, once you've mapped it out literally, then identify what is your highest leverage, and then how do you train that system to perform the way you need it to perform. Number 4, and this was an equally big one, failure to design a clear goal. There are some essential criteria for a good goal. It's got to be positive. It can't be negative. When I'm snowboarding and I go, don't hit the rock, don't hit the rock, don't hit the rock, you can imagine what happens. If instead I think about go between the rocks, things go much, much better. It needs to be reality-based. That is, based specifically on what reality needs, not some illusion about what we would like to have happen, not some fantasy. It needs to be measurable, and it needs to be time-specific. Those two are important because we need to understand the ramp rates of the different resources in the system if we're going to achieve the goal. If it's a small increase or over, say, 50 years, then the slope of performance looks something like this. If the need is more urgent or larger, it looks something like this. And by the way, some have misinterpreted my work to say that I'm trying to establish a BHAG, Collins and Porras's big, hairy, audacious goal from their book, Built to Last. That's not what we're doing at all. We're simply reflecting what reality needs, and reality itself is quite compelling. I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by those kinds of goals. We'll look at fisheries in the Great Lakes, forests in the southern US, and poverty and social injustice in Guatemala. In the first example, the Great Lakes, in order to do any kind of analysis, we need to have a standard by which to compare the current system to what's needed. So we asked the group we were working with to come up with a measurable time-specific goal, and here's what popped up at first. It was that by 2025, and this work was done in, I think, 2017, 2 to 3 fisheries improvement projects will have reached or are making progress towards sustainability benchmarks. Now, if you're trying to restore the fisheries in the Great Lakes, that's a pretty paltry goal. That's not taking any kind of a reality-based stand. And so we worked with him to say, what does reality say really must happen by when in order for you to really be successful? After a lot of deep discussion and even soul searching, they came up with a goal that established them as the true leaders for the ecosystem as a whole. And while I won't read the whole thing, I'll just speak to some of the keywords: diverse, resilient, and abundant, sustainable native fish stocks, and most importantly, an overall 15% increase in availability of harvestable species. This radically changed their strategy that they'd been pursuing for the prior decade and put them on the path to success that they're still on today. The southern forests, they originally had a focus on a 2060 timeline. Now, they originally had a focus on a 2060 timeline, and this is often where we start with certain companies or certain organizations because they don't necessarily even know enough about their ecosystem to set a viable goal. There's a learning process that has to happen. And so as that learning process began to kick in over time, when I went back and worked with them again 5 years later, that shifted to a 2030 fact-based imperative. And let me show you how that came about. This is what's called a behavior over time graph, an incredibly valuable tool for aligning around a shared view of reality, a major problem in so many of today's conversations. The way this works is that on the left-hand axis, that vertical text is a goal that they designed as a refinement of their original 2060 goal. This is just a set of keywords to help them keep that in mind. Once that's established, then at the top, representing 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, that's defined as diverse and robust forest markets. And then we say, well, what does it look like when it's failing? And at the bottom there, they'll say nobody has any incentive to keep their land in forest. Then we lay out a timeline and we say, well, how far back do we need to go to understand what's happening in the larger ecosystem that's pushing and pulling your goal up or down? And after a bit of conversation, they agreed to go back to 1950. At that point, I begin to move my cursor up and down the vertical axis and say, okay, where was it in 1950? And someone initially says an 8, and then someone else says a 3, and then finally someone says, no, it was about a 6. And in each of those junctures, I ask them, what has you say that? Here's we're moving from an opinion-based conversation to a fact-based conversation. And what begins to happen is people begin to share information back and forth across the group. In this case, it was a group of individuals, many of whom had never met before. And they're suddenly learning from all these different perspectives in the room. They finally land on 6. And once that happens, I ask, well, where does it go from there? Does it go down? Does it stay flat? Does it go up? And eventually they agree that it goes up. And once they say up, I ask at what slope? And they give me that slope. And then I say, for how long does that continue? And along the way, they're citing the reasons why it's continuing on that slope until 1978. And then they say, then it took a sharp downward turn. And again, what has you say that? And so these are examples of some of the data points that they called out and agreed about that determine the performance of their goal in the larger ecosystem as a whole. And eventually we get down to today, and you see it's got a slight downward slope. And so I ask a fairly sobering question. This is a system, and you're a part of this system. And you've been hiring smarter and smarter people, raising more and more money, doing better and better projects, and yet your goal is still trending downward. Unless something significantly different happens, how is your goal likely to perform going forward? And it's a fairly somber moment. And after a bit of discussion, they have to agree that it's going to continue that downward trend. And for some markets, it's going to be even worse. So then we ask the question, in order for your goal to thrive or even survive, what must happen by when? And this is a critical question. It's not a how question. Forget about how. We can't think about how. This is basically just the math of it. What must happen by when? And that's where you get that steep vertical line. Once we know that, then we can determine, well, then how do we close the gap between where is the system heading and where does it need to go? Now, once we've completed this process, this radically shifts the energy in the room because now they're all aligned on a shared goal and a shared view of reality, and they understand the dynamic of what's going on, and they understand how urgent the need to respond is. And this, again, is a part of that shift from a low change, high predictability world to a high change, low predictability world, an understanding they've now largely embodied. Guatemala. When we began the work in Guatemala, their goal was reducing poverty and social injustice. This had been their goal for the prior 40 years, and poverty and social injustice had only worsened. So we suggested a process for those in Guatemala to rethink what the goal should be. It turns out that they couldn't even define poverty among themselves. Some people living in Guatemala City, making an income above the poverty line, significantly above the poverty line in some cases, were miserable. Others living in the interior, farming on the hillsides, raising corn and potatoes in the traditional way, in a traditional village, were incredibly happy. even though they were earning below the stated poverty level. So being unable to agree on who was really poor, they redefined their goal, and it became ensuring individual economic self-determination. Now, this goal suddenly had all sorts of attention in Guatemalan society. The prior goal was an old, unsuccessful goal, and very few people in society, very few sectors were interested in talking about it. But this new goal excited the military because they were graduating officers into society who had to go make a living outside of the military. It caught the attention of the former economics minister who was now working on local economic development. The universities were interested because they were turning out students, and those most impacted by poverty and social injustice saw this as a path toward a future they believed in. Number 5, crippling execution. Remember this? When I talked about both what we're up to, that's the goal, and our understanding about the urgency of the goal, and the how. This is the executional component. A hierarchy assumes that there's a higher order view of space and time held by a few, that there's superior knowledge and information held as you move up in the organization, and better skills and abilities. And most damaging of all is that we're operating in a relatively stable context. That is, we have time for the information to flow up and down, and for adequate deliberation and decision-making. But all of that is changing now. Today's context requires a higher order view of time and space, and a view of the interrelated parts and the whole. So each individual in the ecosystem has to understand how the ecosystem operates. Yes, there needs to be superior knowledge and information, but it needs to be applicable to the local people and situation. And that's really hard to transmit up in a hierarchy. It requires evolving skills and abilities, specific to both global and local needs, as those two are interrelated. And it requires real-time responses, almost like a reflex, in response to today's high change, low predictability world. So if we're to harness self-determination in our own systems, then there's some essential self-governing criteria. For each thing that needs to happen in execution, there needs to be a role defined for that. And that role needs to have a purpose, and that purpose has certain accountabilities that are expressed in terms of projects and tasks. And that role needs ongoing group feedback and innovation in order to stay on track with its part of the system in a way that doesn't harm other parts of the system. Here are a few of the systems I've explored to help ensure successful execution on the leverage points we've identified when we take an inclusive, systems-based approach to solving complex multi-stakeholder problems. Of these systems, I've landed on holacracy because, in my view, it most closely mimics how life itself operates. If you look out in nature at an ecosystem, each of the actors in the ecosystem is operating autonomously, pursuing their own goals, but in a way that works for the ecosystem as a whole. And that's what I've learned from holacracy. The other thing that attracted me to holacracy was their software for managing self-organizing systems, Glass Frog. When I first saw it, I was immediately struck by their concept of circles and nested circles, and how that was, for me, a reflection of the systems maps that I develop in collaboration with my clients. You'll notice the different colored sections, each of which represents what you could call a large circle, and the smaller elements within that, the smaller circles that you see here. So there was a direct one-to-one mapping for me between the strategy we developed and how execution needed to happen in an optimal way. So you're emerging impact. Where do you start? Well, I start with a mindset that the impossible isn't, and that it can't be. We don't get to make that excuse anymore. There's the book on Amazon, which looks like this. If you search on R. Scott Spann, you should be able to find it. I have videos on LinkedIn and YouTube with tips on how to work in this way. I have a $97 introductory training called 7 Days to Effortless Leadership that walks you through how to do the fundamental mapping required for any of these efforts. And then there's formal training and certification at 4 different levels: individual, team, organization, and ecosystem. I've created all of this and will continue to create because I'm committed to your future impact. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, concerns, or even suggestions about how we solve the kinds of complex, impossible problems currently confronting business, society, and the earth today. Take care. Bye-bye.